already tried 2 attempts at filming this that went way too long, so here goes. 12 years ago, I downloaded my first synthesizer plugins and DAW and tried my hand at producing electronic synthesizer-focused music. After tons of trial and error, advice from others, teaching myself synthesizers, and releasing countless tracks as miles away, I've been blessed to turn synthesizers and electronic music into, fortunately and accidentally, a full-time career and business for myself. So I wanted to make this video to talk about all those little tips and tricks and things I wish I knew along the way with regards to sound design, using synthesizers in music production, choosing your synthesizer, whatever that might be. This is the video for that. So that the video doesn't end up being over an hour long, I'm going to go over each of the tips pretty quickly, but if you have questions, let me know in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them, as well as make potentially longer tutorials on some of these if there's enough interest. Let's get started. Synth sound design tips. Starting off, adding a bit of grittiness into an otherwise simple and clean sound is one of the easiest and most valuable ways to make a sound more interesting, more professional, and make it cut through the mix more. My favorite way of achieving this is sending noise as a mod source to the filter or the pitch of the oscillators, but you can achieve this as well with some cross modulation or FM. Just make sure to do it in moderation unless you want your sound to get totally crazy. Similarly, it's better to do a lot of subtle modulation versus 1 or 2 things that are really obvious. A good example of this is my favorite type of modulation to do is a little bit of pitch LFO on 1 or both of the oscillators, whereas I don't do a lot of patches that are going to have 4 LFOs at maximum depth modulating a bunch of different things, because as fun as those sounds are to make, they distract the listener and it's hard to mix them into full tracks. Continuing the theme of less is more, it's very counterintuitive, but often the fattest patches you can make on a synthesizer are the ones that don't take advantage of all of its voices, oscillators, and features. One of my favorite bass patches, for example, that's on almost every single record, is just a simple square wave going through a low-pass filter. That's it, nothing else. That bass will always sound fatter in the mix and by itself than a unison bass with 16 oscillators all going together and phasing. Synth envelopes are one of the most underrated tools for sound design. One of my favorite things to do is to simulate a compressor by having a really fast decay time, really fast attack, and then adjusting the sustain like a threshold for a compressor. This will help the transients poke through and can achieve a really punchy, bright sound that will cut through almost everything. Similarly, for any synth keys, I like to have 0 sustain and instead use the decay to simulate what happens in the real physical world, which is that physical acoustic instruments can't sustain forever. Just doing this simple tip can make your synth keys sound a lot more realistic and help them not get in the way of each other if you're playing long, big, sustained chords. Final envelope tip is a bit more complicated, but it's seriously cool. I like to use an auxiliary third envelope with delay sent to the volume of oscillator 2 and then pitch that oscillator 2 up an octave to simulate a granular octave up delay. If your synth can do this, it's seriously one of the coolest effects around. Stereo width in synthesizers is often a little misunderstood and sometimes overused, and I tend to stay away from using pan spread on my synth at 100%, and I also tend to stay away from stereo effects like chorus and flanger and phaser. I find they don't always create a stereo image I like. Instead, if I want a stereo part, if I'm in the studio, I'll double track 2 mono parts left and right, which sounds great, or if your synth allows it, use binaural synthesis. What's binaural synthesis? It's when you take the same mono patch, you duplicate them left and right, and then you do little changes like this to each of the sounds to create a really natural stereo image. This almost always sounds better to my ears than any other stereo effect on synths, and it's actually really easy to achieve with plugins as well. Just duplicate your patch, hard pan left and right, change a few things on one, and then send the same MIDI to both. Amazing analog synth tone does not mean warm with no high end. That's a fallacy. Instead, the best quality synths I've found have a very full frequency response with a lot of presence in the high end. It's just not harsh and there's a lot of sweet spots. You can emulate this by running a more harsh synth through a saturation plugin or a gentle dirt guitar pedal for warmth. While we're talking about sound design and inside the DAW, one of my favorite tricks you can really only do with plugins is swapping out whatever noise source is in that noise mod trick from before with a complex sample. While we're looking at sound design inside the DAW, resampling synthesis is probably my #1 favorite secret weapon for making really interesting synth sounds. For example, I recorded this track with a bunch of different parts of my hardware synths. I compressed all the synth parts together, rendered them out, and started chopping them up to create what I think is a really unique lead sound for this track. A ton of the character and nuance we love in analog synths actually comes from all the little physical imperfections in the oscillator pitch, filter calibration, etc. You can actually simulate this really well in many modern plugins and other synths with parameters like random and chaos being added to different things. Don't just limit yourself to the pitch, go for filter, go for envelope length, go for the effects time, whatever it might be. Similarly, a lot of what makes classic analog synthesizers sound so good is their filters. The type of filter a synth has is, in my opinion, the most important feature and defines what kind of sounds you'll be able to do and what kind of sounds you won't. If you're going to invest in a hardware synth, it's my humble opinion that it's worth spending a little extra for something with analog filters, because as great as digital oscillators are these days, there's still some magic about a pure analog filter that has yet to, in my humble opinion, be fully recreated. On that subject, but whether you're with plugins or hardware, using contrasting filter types is one of the best ways to naturally make your synths mix in well together. For example, one of my most used combos of all time is a warm 24 dB per octave ladder filter bass paired with bright 12 dB per octave SEM filter chords. Because of how different these two filter types are, this combo will almost always work well together. Instead of buying a MIDI controller to control your plugins, consider buying a used synthesizer with a full-length keyboard that's good quality. Examples include a Modal, Argon, or Cobalt. Those have great FITAR keyboards, aren't very expensive on the used market, and that way you can have the opportunity to dip your feet into hardware synthesis as well as use your plugins. What I've found when it comes to buying synthesizers is that the more expensive you go, the less features you get, but the more the synth is just one big sweet spot. Try reverse engineering one of your favorite presets from one of these more expensive character synths, and then while it might not be as easily recallable to design from scratch, you'll have access right away with just a click of a mouse to a great sounding preset that can inspire you in new songs. And one more thing about buying synthesizers and gear, there's a bit of a fallacy that it's not about the gear, it's about the ear. And while that's definitely true, you can absolutely create fantastic songs on just nothing but free stock plugins many people have. There is definitely something to be said about having, whether it's plugins or hardware, a versatile lineup of different synths and knowing which one is right for the job. Going back to our previous example, no matter how hard I try, I'm just not going to be able to create a warm ladder filter Moog style bass on my OB6 with its bright SEM filter. The good news is that many plugins nowadays have emulations of pretty much every filter type you'd want, so no matter your setup, you'll benefit from a free plugin like Vital, which has pretty much every filter under the sun, and that way you can learn what types of characters and filter types you naturally like, and you'll have a jack of all trades to cover for the rest. Reverb and delay are amazing, but they're also one of the quickest ways to ruin the mix and ruin the definition of your synthesizer music. If you have a really wet part, consider contrasting it with something completely dry, because that will give reference to the sound that has a ton of reverb and help your mix not fall apart. For really complex synthesizers that might take you out of the moment because of how hard they are to program really good sounds diving through menus, consider having separate sessions where you just do sound design and save presets, and then challenge yourself to have to make a song starting with one of those presets that you've made. You'll find that being in the flow state and not having to worry about jumping through menus will help you complete more tracks and get more use out of your synthesizers. If that doesn't sound like your workflow, then that's a really good reason to want to look into a knob per function hardware synth like I really like to do, where I don't have to worry about menus and I can just create sounds on the fly. Be careful of bad advice from people on the internet, including me, and people in synthesizer forums. There's a lot of great advice out there, but there's a lot of really bad advice as well, so make sure you critically think and use your ears. The absolute best way to know if a synth is for you or not is to try it in person or get a free trial if it's a plugin, and if that's not possible, at least make sure that you are listening to reviews and demos from people who have similar music taste than you, because everything is so subjective. Finally, if you do find yourself not clicking with the synth, make sure you give it time to fully learn it. Like any creative hobby or endeavor, synthesis takes time and takes a lot of work to get competent and good at. And for the love of God, don't judge a synth based on its factory presets. Those are almost always bad, and it's one of the quickest ways to miss out on an otherwise great synthesizer. Alright, so that's all I have time for here. The sun is almost down and I'm almost out of light. This took longer than I expected, but let me know in the comments what you think of these tips, if you have any questions, and if there's any specific tips you want to see longer videos on from me. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.